Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each midweek episode, we will be marvelling at glorious pearls of contemporary British political interest.
Well, it's been a quiet few weeks for the news, but as yet, of course, it's been a very dramatic time. And we thought we'd try and put two of the three big news stories of the moment into a bit of historical context. The one that we're not touching upon is England's march to victory in the World Cup over in North America. But what we are going to talk about is the by-election that's coming up in Clacton and also Andy Burnham's upcoming coronation as both leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister. So, Richard, why don't you kick us off with your matter of interest?
Well, Nigel Farage's recent surprise resignation as an MP, followed by his intention to stand in the ensuing by-election, puts him in a small category of MPs who have willingly given their electorates another chance to sack them prematurely before a general election. This is, of course, a strategy which contains inherent risks in it. What if your political career is short-circuited by your constituents? But it may also carry some potential gains. But what those gains might be are not in of themselves obvious. And so I thought it would be worth reflecting on the history of MPs who have voluntarily subjected themselves to a by-election. And so the first thing to say is that this practice used to be much more common until 100 years ago. From the early 18th century, basically from the Hanoverian succession, right up until 1926, it was the law of the land in this country that if you took a ministerial appointment, then you had to first subject yourself to a by-election and get the approval of your constituents before you took on that appointment. The idea for this came from the post-Restoration period in the late 17th century, when, in particular, King James II was known to have used crown appointments to basically try to buy off MPs so that Parliament was weighted in the Crown's favour. And so the idea here was that if you take a ministerial appointment, you are accepting a salary that ultimately comes from a Crown appointment, and your constituents are the crucial check to make sure that this is not a corrupt appointment, but is an appointment for a wider good. That practice astonishingly continued right up until, as I said, until 1926. And it meant that if you were an ambitious MP, there was this hazard that you faced. And occasionally, some very significant MPs were taken out by their constituents. At least two future prime ministers, Lord John Russell and perhaps most famously of all, Winston Churchill, lost their ministerial by-elections. Winston Churchill lost his by-election when he was made president of the Board of Trade in 1908 in, wait for it, northwest Manchester. So that was the practice until 100 years ago. Since then, it's much rarer, but I think there are two categories of MPs who have resigned and then stood in the by-election. The first are party switchers. Right, so these are MPs who are elected under one party flag. They switch flags during the Parliament, and then to get a mandate from their electorates for doing so, they cause a by-election. Most MPs who switch parties do not do this, although they almost always face some kind of challenge to do this. It's notable that none of the current Reform MPs who were elected as Conservatives in 2024 have bothered to seek the approval of their electorates for doing so. Back in the 1980s, when you had a whole nother tranche of MPs who betrayed the party that voted for them in, those who joined the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, just one of them subjected themselves to a by-election. The MP who was elected as a Labour MP for Mitcham and Morden, Bruce Douglas Mann, in 1982, he did the noble thing and said, I'm joining this new party. I will get the confirmation of my constituents in Mitcham and Morden for doing so. And in the by-election, his constituents said, bye-bye. Bruce Douglas Mann never was an MP ever again, in spite of repeated attempts as a SDP, Liberal Democrat person, to try to get back into Parliament. It never worked out for him. The second category of MPs who have caused by-elections and then stood in them in more recent times are those who I would describe as policy advocates. So this is sort of the last gasp of a frustrated backbencher or opposition MP who feels that all of the internal pressure they've tried to exert within the House of Commons has failed. And so they try to exert extra parliamentary pressure on the government by going back to their constituents. One dramatic example of this was in 1986, when all of the Unionist MPs in Northern Ireland, both those who were elected as Ulster Unionist MPs and Democratic Unionist MPs, agreed collectively to resign en masse in order to protest the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which was bringing in more consultation with the Republic of Ireland on all Ireland policy matters. And this was seen as a move away from the integration of the United Kingdom to something more desired by Irish nationalists. Now, in that situation, almost all of the nationalist parties decided not to contest the by-elections against the Unionist candidates, except in seats where the previous general election there had been actually a majority for nationalist candidates, but the vote had been split between them. So if you're thinking about Sinn Féin and the SDLP as the nationalist parties, they may have together got over 50% of the vote, but a unionist got in because they had split the vote. So in those cases, they did agree to stand. But in the, I think it was 11 out of 15 of those cases, they chose not to put up a candidate. This resulted in absurd election results, sort of North Korean-style victories, where, for example, in North Antrim, the Reverend Ian Paisley was elected with 97% of the vote. A more recent example is in 2008, when David Davis, the Shadow Home Secretary, resigned as an MP and caused a by-election in his constituency in Halton Price and Howden over Labour's increasing of the time to detain terrorist subjects without charge, something that the Labour government only managed to get through thanks to the support of the DUP because of the number of Labour rebellions against it. Now, in that case, much like the current case with Nigel Farage, much like the case with the Ulster Unionists, the Labour Party and also the Liberal Democrats decided not to stand against David Davis. And the idea here, much like the Irish nationalists in 1986 behaved, was to try to trivialize these elections, to make them seem as acts of self-indulgence rather than matters that could generate some kind of political mandate or energy. And I think that's really what happened to David Davis in 2008. It was seen as a self-indulgent, vanity by-election. And in the end, I would argue it probably cost him the Home Secretaryship because he had been Shadow Home Secretary. He was not brought back as Shadow Home Secretary after that stunt. And then when the Conservatives went into government, Theresa May was made Home Secretary. So I think it was actually a risk that did not pay off for his political career. So I just thought it was just important to look at some of the context there. We can maybe have a discussion, Lee, about where Nigel Farage fits in with that. But I wonder what your thoughts are on this strategy of causing by-elections. Do you think I've got the categories right? Are there other examples or instances that you think I've sort of left out?
I think there is now a third category that I'll come on to in a moment, but it's only existed for a couple of days. The defection switchers example is really interesting because, of course, they're under no constitutional duty to resign their seat and stand again. They've been elected as individual MPs and they're entitled to remain there. But there is arguably a moral duty to do so, to basically go back before their voters and say, look, you elected me with one banner, here I am with another, do you still want me? As you say, many MPs have resisted that call when they've defected. But the hilarious thing really about why there has been some pressure on Tory defectors to reform, of which it's worth remembering there have still only been 4 this Parliament. The hilarious thing about why there's more pressure on them is because some of the most celebrated examples of MPs who defected and then called a by-election were other people who were in a Nigel Farage-led party, the defectors to UKIP in 2014, Douglas Carswell, MP for Clacton, and also Mark Reckless, MP for Rochester and Stroud. Both of them resigned their seats, stood for UKIP, and won quite resounding victories. And so there is a curious thing to try and think through there about why does Reform in 2026 feel less confident that it would hold by-elections caused by defectors seeking a renewed mandate than UKIP did in 2014. All of the signals are that Reform now are much stronger than UKIP was then, but nevertheless, Nigel Farage is not willing to gamble on having defectors play the same game. I think your analysis of the David Davis one in particular, as an example of somebody trying to have a by-election to have a fight about policy, in particular policy they feel very strongly about, was correct. I mean, people do forget that he was Shadow Home Secretary. Just 3 years before that, he had been defeated by David Cameron for the leadership of the party. And Cameron had to keep him close because he was still seen, although it was a very comprehensive win for Cameron in 2005, as a relatively big beast. He never returned to the front bench under David Cameron. The next we really saw of David Davis was when he became chief Brexit negotiator under Theresa May in 2016. So really, it held back his career for the best part of a decade. And also, it didn't even really give him the battle with the Labour government that he wanted in the by-election. It really does take two to tango, or, to mix metaphors. If you're trying to have a boxing match where you're the only person in the room, i.e. the other parties don't stand a candidate, well, you've got nobody to fight, and you end up looking rather silly. Davis did then, and I think the view that people had at the end of the day, Farage made this statement around 2:00 that he was going to resign his seat and cause a by-election. I think it only took about 8 to 10 hours for people to realise that it was starting to look a bit farcical and was not really going to achieve, at least what we can tell now, what Farage really wanted it to. My initial thought when hearing Farage say he was going to resign and trigger this by-election was that the other parties shouldn't stand, and in fact, I'm delighted that they didn't. But it is just worth us thinking through, why is Farage doing this? And that leads us on to what I think is the third category now for calling a by-election. And that is to serve some narrower purpose, self-interested purpose, many would say. And in this case, it seems to be that Nigel Farage is very aggrieved about the heightened level of scrutiny that he is receiving as a party leader. Not something he's entitled to really be aggrieved about at all, in my opinion. This man wants to be Prime Minister in the next few years, and he's being asked questions about how 5 million quid comes into his bank account from a Thailand-based crypto multimillionaire. These are legitimate questions to ask somebody who wants to wield extraordinary political power in this country, and he's furious about it. Ultimately, if you want to sit in number 10 Downing Street, you have to be scrutinised for the sort of person who you are. And it's perfectly reasonable that people in the press and elsewhere do that. But he's enormously aggrieved by it and therefore wants to set up this battle so that he can say, here I am with a renewed mandate. My people want me. How dare you criticise me for these things? I think it's very narrow. I think it's very self-interested. I think it lacks the dignity or even the decency, even if it's misplaced and ends up looking rather foolish, of the other two categories of by-election, when people have resigned over a defection or over policy. This is very much about Nigel Farage and Nigel Farage asserting himself. The other thing that I would wonder about this is that Reform UK's polling position in the last year or so has been extraordinary. What Nigel Farage and Reform has achieved has been very impressive. 2 cycles of local elections in which they've topped the poll of the projected national vote share. More than 300 opinion polls in a row where they have been in the lead. These are remarkable achievements for an insurgent party. And whilst I'm a Reform and Farage sceptic, I don't wish to take those away from him at all. But we can't deny the fact that Reform's polling position is also declining. In the days leading up to this podcast, there was a YouGov poll that had Reform on 25%, the Conservatives on 21%, and Labour on 20%, and a More in Common poll that had Reform on 27%, the Conservatives on 22%, and Labour on 21%. These are not a world away from basically being 3 parties pretty much tied in the opinion polls. And we'll see what happens when Burnham comes in and what that may do for them. And so what is Farage trying to do really in calling this by-election in Clacton? Well, he wanted to try and have a by-election, an electoral contest, in what is basically the most pro-reform constituency in the country, in which the candidate on the ballot would be the leader of reform, the most famous reform politician in the country. And what I think he wanted was all of the parties to stand, and he would win on 50, 60 odd percent of the vote. And this would be, wow, here's the momentum, here's the energy in British politics again. And it's with Farage and it's with reform. Now, the very reason why Farage stood in Clacton is that it is the most favourable constituency in the country, according to several projections for reform. It was the one that, as I mentioned earlier, Douglas Carswell had defected to UKIP, stood in the by-election and won, and the only seat that UKIP ever won in a general election. The next general election, they lost Rochester and Stroud, they held Clacton. So I think he wanted to try and have this PR boost from his own constituency as well, which he will now be denied. The final thought I wanted to throw into this is that this isn't a by-election that I'm going to mention. It was a general election, and we don't know what's going to happen yet. For now, it looks as if Farage is not going to have any serious opponents, except for the man with a bin on his head, which I find as funny as the next person, by which I mean I find it a bit funny. I mean, that's a slightly worn joke by now. But Farage is unlikely to have a serious candidate against him. But there is still time for that to maybe emerge. And so I throw in, as an example, Tatton in the 1997 general election. So Neil Hamilton had been a disgraced Tory MP. He stood again in the 1997 general election, and Labour and the Liberal Democrats didn't stand against him, but instead an independent, the journalist Martin Bell, who's famous for these white linen suits that he would wear, he stood. He basically became the Stop Neil Hamilton candidate and did remarkably well with it. He got over 60% of the vote. Although the major parties didn't stand, there were 10 candidates on the ballot paper, but Hamilton and Bell between them got over 97.5% of the vote. They got an enormous vote share between the two of them. But it ended up with Martin Bell winning a majority of over 11,000. And if there's to be any chance, I think, for Nigel Farage to be defeated in this vanity by-election in Clacton, then I think that is what it would take. It would need somebody who was a serious name, probably well known already to people, who could do two very, very difficult things. One is to peel off voters from Nigel Farage, from people in Clacton who already like him, at least to some degree. And the other is to unite people of a more progressive / big C conservative mindset who do not want Nigel Farage. Now, that is a very broad and difficult spectrum of people to unite. And I rather suspect there's nobody out there who could really do it. But really, the story of this by-election felt like it began and ended within just a few hours of the announcement when the other party said they wouldn't stand. And the only way in which I think it has another chapter of any great interest is if somebody who can do that is identified and there's a real fight on the Essex coast.
When thinking about which category Nigel Farage fits in, it could be that he is sui generis and is his own category. I agree that he doesn't obviously fit in the categories of party switcher or policy advocate that define the self-imposed by-elections of the last 100 years. However, I think there's something to be said that Farage sort of fits in the 18th century category. If you go back and think about why Parliament introduced that legislation in the early 1700s, it was, in effect, to give constituents the ability to provide a permission slip to an MP, even if that MP might be doing something dodgy, because it wasn't actually just about ministerial appointment. It was about taking any sinecure from the Crown. Indeed, still today, MPs who want to resign are given an appointment under the Crown, and this dates back to this practice. But I think you're right, Lee, that there's another reason here for Farage, and that's about trying to boost what seems to be the deflating polling figures of reform. If we go back to last July 2025, there were 10 national polls from reputable pollsters that put reform in the 30s, right, above 30%. We have, in the last month, at the time of recording, seen one poll that's put reform above 30% or at 30%. That was in June. I think there's a possibility, but we shall see, that reform might not come above 30 in any poll in the month of July 2026. And so that's quite a change. And also, and you've made this point to me before, so I'm sort of slightly pinching your point here. If you look at the local election results and you look at projected national vote share, which is a figure that political scientists have developed since the early 80s, and it's been used by the BBC, for example, I think since 1982. So it's very reputable. What it does is it imagines if the local elections had been held everywhere in the country, so taking the data, the real data of local elections, but using that to form estimations of how other parts of the country would vote, what would the national vote share of the parties be? And the idea behind this is to dispel the distortions that occur if, say, London's voting one year, but another year London isn't voting and another part of the country is. If you look at that, Reform went down 4 points between 2025 and 2026. So although Reform, of course, made huge gains in the local elections this year, it made gains from a starting point of 0 relative to 4 years ago, if that's what your comparison is, which is where you see the net increases in seats. But if you look at it in terms of what's the momentum of the party in this parliament, what it looks like at the moment is that Reform was riding a wave after Labour came into government, especially after what many people on the right viewed as Keir Starmer's botched response to the horrible killings of the little girls in Southport by Axel Rudikubana and the aftermath of that. Reform goes above Labour by the end of 2024 and above the Conservatives and rides top in the polls throughout 2025. And in 2026, it's still in a plurality position, but as you're saying, Lee, it is now in decline. And this is an opportunity for Farage to try to seize some attention back to Reform at a time when Labour is getting a lot of attention because it's replacing a disastrously unpopular, politically inept leader in Keir Starmer and putting in his place someone who's a real politician and political communicator in Andy Burnham, most popular Labour politician in the country. And Kemi Badenoch has done very well. She's currently the most popular party leader in the country. And so in that context, there's a real risk that Reform gets squeezed out. Because the final thing I'll say is once Reform starts not being top in the polls, and let's say particularly if Reform starts coming behind the Conservatives in the polls, that split on the right, which currently has been to the benefit of Reform, may start flipping to the benefit of Conservatives. Because if you're someone on the right and you're making a tactical decision about what is the best party to support to get rid of Labour, once the signals go back to being the official opposition, the Conservative Party, that's a very dangerous position for Reform to be in.
There's a final thing I just wanted to say where there is arguably a fourth category, which isn't the one that Farage is in, but it's sort of adjacent to his position, which is MPs who have stood again in a recall petition. So there is this looming question of will all of this hullabaloo about Nigel Farage's donations, personal donations to him, will that lead to a standards investigation that finds him to have behaved improperly and therefore enables this process where if 10% of the voters of Clacton sign a petition, they can have a by-election to recall him. There have been 6 times when it's been possible to have one of those by-elections, i.e. town and village halls have opened up to say, well, come along and sign if you want to recall your MP. In one of those occasions, a 10% threshold wasn't met. That was in Northern Ireland. In the other 5, it was. But on only one of those occasions did the MP actually choose to stand again. And that was Chris Davis, who was a Conservative MP for Brecon and Radnorshire in Wales. And he ended up being defeated by the Liberal Democrats in that particular case. So that is maybe just as a quick thought, a fourth category. If we've got defections, policy principle, vanity or some sort of narrower political interest, but then also perhaps being recalled as well. But most of the people where that happens choose not to fight it. And there is always this open question of, let's say Farage gets back in this by-election that he's caused, and the standards process continues, and there is then the chance to recall him subsequent to that. This could be the first of 2 Clacton by-elections coming up, which would be a fate worse than the people of Clacton deserve.
Lee, what is your matter of interest this week?
Well, this week I wanted to talk about the other great theme of British politics at the moment, and this is the coming of Andy Burnham, both as leader of the Labour Party and also as Prime Minister. And the first thing I wanted to say really is that I think Labour is doing the right thing in terms of how they're choosing a leader midterm. They are not going to have a lengthy, this is relatively lengthy, we're in this slightly absurd limbo at the moment. When Keir Starmer, everyone knows he's going, he's announced his intention to resign. Everybody knows he's going to be replaced by Andy Burnham, and we're just waiting for that transition to happen according to a pretty arbitrary timescale. It is, I described it to somebody the other day, the nearest we have in Britain to a transition period like they have in the United States after presidential elections before the inauguration. We're basically waiting for Burnham's inauguration at the moment, unless something utterly extraordinary and unimaginable happens. But nevertheless, this is going to be a relatively speedy transition from one leader to another. It's going to be without the division of having a party leadership contest when the party is in office. And it is going to somebody who I think is, whilst I am also a Burnham skeptic, I think he's tremendous at the vibes, less good at the substance. He is nevertheless a better politician and will, I think, be a more effective leader than Keir Starmer. So generally speaking, I think Labour is actually handling this rather well. And if we compare it to when the Conservatives were in office last and the midterm changes of Prime Minister that happened then, and particularly if you think about the summer of 2022, the Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak battle, when they spent weeks and weeks. Boris Johnson resigned in July and Liz Truss became Prime Minister in September. They spent all this time tearing chunks out of each other, their supporters briefing about the other in the press and how useless and awful they were. It really damaged the party's reputation in a big way. And everybody crowding around Andy Burnham to lift him up on their shoulders, metaphorically at least, and carry him into number 10 is a rather more dignified and unified way of handling these transitions than might otherwise be the case. It's also, of course, a good sign for Andy Burnham that he inherits a party where nobody is strong enough to stand against him, even with the relatively high threshold of standing for the leader that Labour has, needing 20% of MPs to be behind you. In some ways, this is kind of reminiscent of a bit of Conservative history prior to 1965, where leaders would take the helm via a process called emergence, where there wouldn't be a contest and there wouldn't be ballots of MPs. There certainly wouldn't be ballots of party members or the grassroots. There would be some informal backroom maneuvers in order to settle upon the person who would be the undisputed leader. But I think if we look back to emergence, we can say that, well, sometimes the process of who emerged was very smooth and very easy and very obvious. And sometimes there were basically rivals, and behind the scenes, those rivalries had to be settled. And that's where the first of my warnings for Labour and Burnham comes in. Because if I think in the 20th century, the three Conservative leaders who had the easiest ascent to the top, where there was nobody who was even close to challenging them, basically, were 1902, when Arthur Balfour took over from Lord Salisbury at the beginning of the century, 1937, when Neville Chamberlain took over from Stanley Baldwin, and 1955, when Anthony Eden took over from Winston Churchill. In each case, they were the obvious and undisputed leader. Nobody even really bothered to try and push back against them becoming Prime Minister and party chief. But each went on to be a pretty uncelebrated party leader. In two cases, Chamberlain and Eden, probably the two least celebrated Conservative leaders of the entire century. Now, Balfour was a more impressive man in many respects, but he never won a general election that he fought. And there is this slight irony that the easier the rise to the top of the Tories in the 20th century, the harder they found governing and actually leading the party when they were there. If we drag it slightly more recently, we can look at who were the last Labour and who were the last Conservative leaders to be the only people nominated by their party to take over when in office. We've spoken a bit about the Labour one last time, about Gordon Brown. And in the Conservative case, it was Rishi Sunak in October of 2022, after the Liz Truss implosion. In that case, the threshold to be nominated was raised dramatically to 100 MPs, and he was the only one who both had the names and wanted to stand. Penny Mordaunt didn't have the names, Boris Johnson did, but in the end decided not to stand. And again, if you think about Brown and Sunak, they're both impressive people in many respects. They're both former chancellors of the Exchequer. But neither went on to win a general election. So they both took over a party where nobody else was strong enough to challenge them, and in both cases actually had a bit of a cursed time at the top. And that leads me to think about what are the problems that party leaders who have this charmed rise can sometimes have. And there are at least three of them that I wanted to chuck into the conversation. One of them is that they can be accused of lacking an internal mandate, that they were not actually chosen by the wider party. They were just chosen by almost an absence of anybody else being up to it. That is, in my view, quite a flimsy criticism. What fault is it of Andy Burnham if nobody else is willing to stand against him? But nevertheless, when things can turn a bit sour, people can turn around and say, well, of course, the members actually never got the chance to vote on him. He was never really tested in a leadership contest. Similar things were actually said about Theresa May when the leadership contest was truncated in 2016. They can be seen as having only a partial mandate because the process didn't run its full course. I think it's a weak criticism, but within the next few years, I think certainly expect discontent within the Labour Party to say that about Andy Burnham. The second one, which I think is rather more substantive, is that clearly Keir Starmer has led the Labour Party into a cul-de-sac. The party does not really know where it is, and MPs know that the party needs to change. I certainly think many of them do. Some of them delude themselves into thinking this is just about better comms and PR. It isn't. This is about rejigging the way in which the Labour Party thinks and approaches government in this country. Now, ordinarily, you would expect parties to have some sort of debate about what that would actually look like. Now, what does it mean to change track? What does it mean to have a new injection of ideas at the top of the party? And what are those ideas actually going to be? In this case, there's going to be no debate. Whatever nebulous ideas are associated with Andy Burnham, Burnhamism, Manchesterism, call them whatever you will, they are now just basically accepted as Labour Party policy. Now, there'll be no debate, there'll be no pushback, there'll be no challenge. He said in his big speech in Manchester the other week that he was not going to negotiate and compromise on the direction that he would set. And in some ways, I think that means that the party misses out on a chance to at least think seriously about where it goes next. With again, the caveat that what does that debate often look like in practice? It's party leaders and their teams tearing jokes out of each other. So positives and negatives on that. I think the final thing I just throw into this, and I think this is particularly true in Burnham's case, is that if you don't have the full contest, you don't necessarily have the intimacy and the exposure to party MPs and the backbenchers that you would have if you had to go around glad handing them, trying to get them to nominate and support you. Now, Burnham is coming into this, having not been a Labour MP since 2017. He will not know personally the vast majority of Labour MPs. A great many of them are all 2024 intake. Plenty of them only got in 2019 or 2017, around about the time that he was leaving Parliament. And I'm sure that his team are now doing all they can to try and ingratiate himself. And in fact, it's probably going the other way around. You get MPs who don't really know him, desperate to ingratiate themselves with him and the people around him. But that is arguably a bit of a weakness. That's particularly strong in this case because he's done something pretty unprecedented. He's come from outside of Parliament into Parliament in order to take on the leadership and the premiership straight away. And I think that will be a bit of a challenge for him. And it's one that, if they mishandle it, will come back to bite him. But ultimately, now having thought when writing this book about Conservative leadership processes in recent months, quite a lot about this, the test for almost any leader, basically, in government or out, is can they provide some sort of coherence to what the party is about? And arguably most importantly, can they do well in the opinion polls? And that will fundamentally be the test, I think, for Andy Burnham. If by the end of this year, Labour is back in the lead in the opinion polls and looks like it could win again, then there will be very, very little dissent from his leadership among Labour MPs. If Reform's still in the lead, if the Conservatives have taken the lead, if it still looks like a bit of a three-way split with Labour only on about 1 in 5 votes in opinion polls, then expect some of those criticisms about the way in which he's emerged to be aired within the party.
I like the idea that Andy Burnham is becoming Labour leader through the old Conservative process of emergence. I think there's something really to be said for that. I think that's basically what has happened here. With the exception of Gordon Brown, I think really we can't say has been any other Labour leader who emerged through, who came through emergence. And even in Gordon Brown's case, Brown did have to fight for those nominations to at least try to get sufficient nominations to stop any other candidate from being able to stand against him. So we've done a podcast episode on this, but back in 2007, Michael Meacher and John McDonnell, both in the Socialist Campaign Group, sought MPs' nominations to get on the ballot. And what Gordon Brown did is he went not just to the Brownites, but he went to the Blairites and other MPs who were not Socialist Campaign Group MPs and said, please nominate me for the leadership so I can get enough nominations such that no other MP, even if all of the other MPs who aren't nominating me nominated them, could not get on the ballot. And that's exactly what he did. I think he got in the end something like 89% of Labour MPs to nominate him to achieve that. But I think if you're of a different part of the party from the candidate who is the juggernaut, who's almost certainly going to win the leadership, you might wonder, well, why not just have that challenge? Why not just have that debate? Surely that will strengthen the party and also allow you to put your ideas out there. But I think there are real risks for doing that as well. Not necessarily saying that those aren't risks worth taking, but there are real risks to your own cause. So I think back to 1992, when Neil Kinnock resigned. And it was pretty obvious that the Shadow Chancellor, John Smith, was going to be elected Labour leader. John Smith was on the right of the Labour Party. He was a Europhile. I've written a chapter in a book arguing that he was the most pro-EU leader or EEC leader that the party has ever known. And those on the left of centre of the party, who are more Eurosceptic, thought it was important to put forward a candidate who put forward what we might call the Eurosceptic Keynesian arguments against the Europhile fiscal prudence arguments of Smith. And they put in front of that, they chose for that candidate to be Brian Gould, who'd been a significant member of the Kinnock Shadow cabinet. And he was absolutely wiped out by John Smith in the Labour leadership contest. There was one article written at the time that said that the only conceivable electoral system in which John Smith wouldn't have been elected leader in 1992 was the system that was used to elect the Dalai Lama, which is famously a child chosen at random in the mountains by some wandering priests. So in that case, was it good for the Labour Party that Brian Gould stood against John Smith? Maybe. It wasn't necessarily bad for the party. Was it good for the Eurosceptic Keynesians for Brian Gould to stand and get absolutely smashed? I would argue not, because it gave a huge mandate to kind of Smithian, centrist European social democracy over the more British economic nationalism of Gould and his colleagues. And so there might be a risk, because look, as people know, I sort of see myself more in the Blue Labour family of any of the factions of the party. And there's part of me, and I've said this to some Blue Labour MPs, put someone forward. You're not going to win. You may not even get the nominations, but put someone forward and have the argument and get those Blue Labour ideas out there and show that the Labour Party is not just a party of metropolitan liberals. I haven't had a lot of positive response from MPs of that persuasion over that. And perhaps that's quite understandable, because there is a risk that if Blue Labour did do that and failed miserably, then there would be this narrative that would form that would say Blue Labour is a busted flush. Look how unpopular Blue Labour is compared to Andy Burnham. And I suspect that's also the view of other MPs like Wes Streeting, who is more of a kind of Blairite MP, who probably understands that if he stands against Burnham, he's going to get crushed as well. So if you can't beat them, join them. Ultimately, it's somewhat cowardly to behave like that, I suppose. But also I can understand the political logic for refraining from doing so.
I assume in the Blue Labour case as well, what they're probably thinking is that the vibes of Burnham, we'll find out about the substance in due course, is at least compatible with lots of what Blue Labour talks about. We think about the sort of constituencies that Andy Burnham won in Makerfield and where he's seen as having the greatest appeal. His connection to place and some of the things that he talked about the importance of community, etc. Some of these are themes that I think Blue Labour people can be relatively happy with. The difficulty with Burnham is that he spent quite a long time, but he's courted the leadership despite not being in Parliament. People easily forget when he went to Labour conference in Liverpool and was being talked up as a rival and successor to Keir Starmer, and was then seen as having bungled the whole thing, really, in that conference. So much so that he left just as Keir Starmer was taking the stage. I mean, he actually looked really pathetic and quite weak at that moment in time. The exact opposite of how he looks now. It's a remarkable turnaround. But one of the challenges I think he's had in this time in which he's trying to position himself to have broad appeal as a potential leader, a challenge he has undoubtedly met very effectively, is that he's sort of tried to say different things that would appeal to all peoples. And so, yes, I think people are pretty right to conclude that there's no benefit really in standing against him, because he's said enough to everyone that makes them think, oh, well, he might actually agree with me, or he agrees with me enough that I don't really need to challenge him. That's probably true for the Blairites, just as it's true for people in Blue Labour, just as it's true for the soft left. You know, he has the potential to be a unifying leader. He also has the potential to let people down who are currently cheering him on. But that's true always in political leadership.
I think my other concern about having a campaign against Burnham at this stage is that I'm not sure that the Parliamentary Labour Party is really up for the debate at the moment. I know there are many Labour MPs who don't fit into this category, but there's a whole chunk of the Parliamentary Labour Party whose main criteria for being selected as a Labour candidate in a safe or competitive seat was whether or not they were seen to be loyal to Keir Starmer. And at the time, I remember watching them do these selection videos and seeing them selected, and I thought, what really do you believe? What is your contribution? What is your value added to the Parliamentary Labour Party? What are the motivations that bring you into Parliament? Is it just to be an MP, or is it to be an MP to do something? And what are the causes that are close to your heart beyond vague platitudes about making Britain a nicer, fairer, cuddlier place? What's your real conviction? And I'm afraid to say that I still think that there's this chunk of MPs who are yet to at least show, perhaps even to know, what is their philosophy? What are the core convictions they have? So I'm not even sure that many Labour MPs, I'm afraid to say, are even up to having a debate about the direction of the Labour Party, because they're just so used to thinking, well, to be a good Labour MP is just to nod along with what the leadership says, or what I'm told to say by the people who are directing me through my political career. And that makes me very sad indeed when I think about the great history of the party and the fierce debates that Labour has had in its past, and that spirit of internal debate, both in the membership and in the parliamentary party, I think has been severely constrained in the last 6 years of Keir Starmer's leadership. And some people look at that and say that's good. Labour should not be having internal debates. It should be facing the country. I disagree. I think in order to face the country with confidence, we have to have the debates internally. And I hope that's one of the things that changes under the Burnham leadership, that we restore a greater sense of pluralism, debate, and thrashing out ideas between ourselves, and then ultimately coming together before the electorate.
Well, that's all for this midweek episode. Hopefully you've had the time to hear the interview we did with Alwyn Turner that went out last Sunday about his book on Britain in the Interwar Years, A Shell-Shocked Nation. We're continuing the book club theme this Sunday, when we'll be interviewing Glenn O'Hara about his book, New Labour, New Britain, in which we try and answer the question, did Tony Blair really change Britain during his 10 years as Prime Minister? We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.